A low rumble echoed through the wagon, a constant companion to the creak of the wheels. Young Clara, barely 4 seasons old, felt her head bump against the rough wooden side, a jolt that sent a kaleidoscope of stars across her vision. She pressed her lips together, a practiced motion. Crying, she knew, would only make things worse. That child is eating us out of house and home. Jedediah Thorne's voice, sharp as a rusted blade, sliced through the hot canyon air. He no longer bothered to lower his voice. 3 grown men could live on what she eats in a week. Clara clutched her cornhusk doll closer, its button eyes long gone, leaving hollow spaces that mirrored the ache in her own chest. Empty. Forgotten. She counted the rough planks above her head for the 100th time. 1, 2, 3. Counting was a way to escape the gnawing hunger in her stomach, the louder hunger for acceptance. "She's just a little girl, Jedediah," her mother Willow said, her voice thin, like a worn piece of cloth, as if she had carried heavy burdens all day. "She doesn't eat that much." Jedediah snorted, a sound like an angry bull. "Yesterday, I caught her sneaking extra hardtack. Yesterday, when we're already 3 days behind schedule because of her weak legs." The summer sun beat down on the wagon canvas like a giant hammer. Sweat trickled down Clara's face, but she didn't dare wipe it away. Moving meant making noise, and making noise meant reminding them she was there. Being invisible was her best trick these days. She pulled out the small wooden eagle her papa had carved for her before the fever took him forever. Its blue paint had worn off from endless touching, but she could still feel where papa's knife had made each tiny feather. She whispered to it, as always, "Papa, please make me good enough so they'll want to keep me." The eagle offered no reply. It never did. Through a gap in the canvas, Clara could see other pioneer wagons, other families. Children ran alongside the wheels, laughing and playing games. Their parents called to them with voices full of love, not anger. Those children got extra water when they were thirsty. They got rides when they were tired. Clara wondered what made those children different. What magic thing did they possess that she was missing? "We're burning daylight because of her," Jedediah continued, his voice growing meaner with each word. "Other families are already miles ahead. We'll be eating snow in the mountains because we're moving at the pace of a sick turtle." "She's trying her best," Willow said, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Her best isn't good enough for surviving out here. You have to choose, Willow. Her or making it to the Golden Valley before winter. You can't have both." Clara's heart stopped for a whole second. Choose. That was the scariest word in the whole world. When grown-ups had to choose, children like her usually lost. She remembered the last time someone had to choose. It was when Papa got sick with the fever. The frontier healer had said someone needed to take care of Papa, but someone also needed to work the homestead. Mama chose to stay with Papa. The homestead withered, and then Papa died anyway. And then Jedediah came along with his promises of a new life in the Golden Valley. Now Jedediah was making Mama choose again. The wagon lurched as they went around a large rock. Clara's wooden eagle fell from her hands and bounced across the wagon floor. She crawled after it, but the wagon hit another bump and sent her tumbling into the sidewall. "What's all that racket back there?" Jedediah's voice boomed like thunder. "Nothing," Clara called out quickly. "Sorry. I'm sorry. "Don't make us move faster," Jedediah grumbled. Clara found her eagle wedged between 2 flour sacks. She held it tight and closed her eyes. In her mind, she could see Papa's face, kind and gentle, telling her stories about brave little birds who found their way home no matter how far they flew. But this wasn't a story, and she wasn't brave. She was just a burden on wheels, slowing everyone down, eating food that belonged to stronger people. Outside the wagon, she could hear the sound of other families calling to each other, planning where to stop for the night, sharing news and jokes. Their voices sounded happy and full of hope. Inside her wagon, there was only the sound of wheels creaking, Jedediah's angry breathing, and Willow's sad silence. Clara pressed her face against the wooden eagle and made a wish on it, like Papa had taught her. She wished to be good enough, strong enough, small enough, that maybe Jedediah would change his mind. Maybe if she ate even less food and walked even more miles and never ever complained about anything, he would see that she was worth keeping. But deep down, in her heart, in the place where scared feelings lived, Clara was starting to understand that some wishes were too big for wooden eagles to carry. The whispering stream sparkled like scattered diamonds in the morning sun, and for just a moment, Clara forgot to be scared. She hadn't seen water this clean and clear since they'd left their old homestead. Fish darted in the shallows, and cottonwood trees offered shade that felt cool as a frontier chapel on Sunday. "Everyone out," Jedediah announced, jumping down from the driver's seat. "Horses need water and rest." Clara climbed down carefully, her bare feet finding the sandy ground. The other wagons in their small pioneer train had already disappeared over the next hill, their dust clouds growing smaller and smaller. She wanted to ask why they weren't following, but asking questions always made Jedediah angry. Willow was moving slowly today, as if each step hurt her bones. Her face looked pale as milk, and she kept pressing her hand against her forehead, trying to push away a bad headache. "Clara, honey," Willow called, in a voice that sounded strange and shaky. "Come here to me." Something cold gripped Clara's stomach and squeezed tight. Mama only used that voice for serious things, like when Papa was dying, or when they had to sell their last cow for traveling money. She walked over to where Willow stood by the wagon wheel. Jedediah was unhitching the horses, his movements quick and jerky, as if he was angry about something. "Sit down here beside me," Willow said, patting a fallen log. Clara sat, her wooden eagle clutched in both hands. Up close, she could see that Willow's eyes were red and watery, as if she had been crying or was about to start. "You remember what I taught you about following the North Star?" Willow asked. "Yes, Mom." The words came out as a whisper. "It points the way home." "That's right. And you remember the story about the Oakhaven family, the kind folks with the big ranch who need help with their children?" Clara nodded, though her throat felt like it was closing up. She remembered the story because Mama had told it 3 times in the last week. The Oakhavens lived 2 days north of here, and they were looking for a girl to help with cooking and cleaning and watching the little ones. "Well, honey, we've been thinking." Willow's voice cracked like a broken dish. "The wagon is awful heavy, and we're moving so slow." "I can walk more," Clara said quickly. "I can walk all day and never complain. I promise." "Oh, sweetheart." Willow reached out as if she wanted to touch Clara's face, but then pulled her hand back. "It ain't about walking. It's about what's best for everyone." Jedediah appeared beside them, carrying a small bundle tied with rope. Clara recognized her extra buckskin dress peeking out from the cloth, along with her corn-husk doll and what looked like food wrapped in brown paper. "The Oakhavens are good people," he said, without looking at either of them. "They'll treat you fair, give you work to do, food to eat, better than what we can offer." The cold feeling in Clara's stomach spread through her whole body like ice water. "You're leaving me here?" "Not leaving," Willow said quickly. "Taking you somewhere better, somewhere you'll be wanted and needed." "And I'm wanted here." Clara jumped up from the log, her wooden eagle falling into the dirt. "I can be better. I can eat less and walk faster and carry heavy things and never cry, not even once." Jedediah shook his head. It ain't about being better, girl. It's about survival. Every pound in that wagon matters. Every mouth to feed matters. You're old enough to understand. But Clara didn't understand. Not really. All she knew was that the people who were supposed to love her forever were packing her things like she was an old coat they didn't need anymore. Mama, she looked up into her mother's face, searching for some sign that this was all a terrible joke. Mama, please don't make me go. Willow's face crumpled like wet paper. I'm sorry, baby. I'm so sorry. But the Oakhavens will take good care of you. And maybe when we get settled in the Golden Valley, we can send for you. It was a lie, and they all knew it. The Golden Valley was 1,000 miles away, and poor people didn't send for anyone. Jedediah handed Clara the bundle. Follow the stream north for 2 days. Stay close to the water so you don't get lost. The Oakhaven place is the big log house with a red barn. You can't miss it. Clara took the bundle because she didn't know what else to do. Her hands were shaking so hard she could barely hold on to the rope. Be good, Willow whispered, and then she turned away and climbed back into the wagon. Jedediah hitched up the horses without saying another word. The stream kept sparkling, and the birds kept singing, and the fish kept swimming, like nothing important was happening at all. When the wagon started moving, Clara ran alongside it for a few steps. Mama, I'll be so good. I promise I'll be the best girl in the whole world. But the wagon didn't stop. The wheels kept turning, and the horses kept walking. And soon, all she could see was dust hanging in the air like a ghost. Clara stood by the whispering stream, holding her bundle and watching the place where her family had disappeared. She waited for them to come back, to realize they'd made a terrible mistake, to remember that she belonged with them. But the sun moved across the sky, and the shadows grew longer, and no one came back for her. Finally, when the air started to cool and the crickets began their evening songs, Clara understood that she was truly alone. She picked up her wooden eagle from where it had fallen and brushed off the dirt. Well, Papa, she whispered to it, I guess it's just you and me now. The creek bubbled and laughed as it flowed north, toward the Oakhaven place, toward people who might want her or might not, toward a future that belonged to everyone except the little girl who would have to live. The rattlesnake's warning buzz, froze Clara's blood as she reached for wild berries on her 4th day alone. She had been crawling on her hands and knees, too weak to stand properly, when her small fingers nearly brushed the coiled serpent hiding beneath the thorny bush. The snake's diamond-patterned body was thick as her arm, its triangular head raised and ready to strike. Clara held perfectly still, remembering her father's teachings about staying calm around dangerous creatures. Her stomach cramped with hunger so fierce it made her dizzy. The few berries she had managed to find yesterday had made her sick, but she didn't know which ones were safe to eat. Everything looked the same, in this endless sea of prairie grass and scattered trees. The whispering stream had grown smaller, barely a trickle now, and she wasn't even sure she was still heading north. The snake slowly uncoiled and slithered away into the tall grass. Clara collapsed backward, her heart hammering like a woodpecker against her ribs. Tears leaked from her eyes, but she was too dehydrated for real crying. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, and her tongue felt like sandpaper in her mouth. Papa, she whispered to the wooden eagle, clutched in her trembling hand. I don't think I can do this anymore. A shadow passed overhead. Clara looked up to see buzzards circling lazily in the blue sky. She had seen enough dead animals on the trail to know what those black birds meant. They were waiting for her to stop moving, stop breathing, stop being a problem for anyone. Maybe that would be easier. Maybe everyone would be happier if she just stayed here and became part of the prairie grass. Her mother wouldn't have to worry about her anymore. Jedediah wouldn't have to share his food or slow down his wagon. The world would keep spinning without Clara Thorne taking up space in it. But then her father's voice seemed to whisper in the wind, "You're stronger than you know, little bird." Clara forced herself to sit up. Her vision swirled with black spots, but she gritted her teeth and refused to fall. She had to keep moving, not because anyone was waiting for her, but because giving up felt like proving Jedediah right about her being useless. She stumbled to her feet and took 3 shaky steps before her legs buckled. As she hit the ground hard, her father's wooden eagle flew from her grasp and tumbled toward the whispering stream. "No!" Clara lunged forward, but her movements were clumsy and slow. The eagle hit the water with a tiny splash and immediately began floating downstream. This time, the tears came hot and fast. That wooden eagle was the last piece of her father she had left. It was proof that someone had once loved her enough to carve something beautiful just for her. Without it, she truly had nothing. Clara crawled to the water's edge and stuck her whole arm in, reaching desperately for the eagle as it spun away in the current. The water was cold and moved faster than it looked. Her father's gift disappeared around a bend, gone forever. She pressed her face into the muddy bank and sobbed until her chest ached. The crying made her even more thirsty, but she couldn't stop. All the fear and loneliness and hunger crashed over her like a flash flood. When the tears finally stopped, Clara lay still beside the stream, watching clouds drift across the sky. A part of her wanted to stay right there and let the buzzards have their way, but another part, a stubborn, angry part that sounded like her father, refused to quit. She cupped water in her hands and drank, even though it tasted like mud. Then she forced herself to stand again. Her legs shook like newborn colts, but they held her weight. A coyote howled somewhere in the distance, and Clara shivered. She had heard stories about wild animals that hunted at night, stories about children who wandered off and were never seen again. But the sun was getting low, painting the prairie gold and orange, and she needed to find shelter before darkness fell. She spotted a cluster of rocks about 50 yards away. It wasn't much, but it might provide some protection from wind and predators. Each step felt like walking through thick mud, but Clara kept moving. As she reached the rocks, her foot caught in a prairie dog hole. She tumbled forward, skinning her knees and palms on the rough stone. Fresh blood mixed with the dirt, already coating her skin. Clara curled up between 2 large boulders as the first stars appeared overhead. The rocks still held warmth from the day's sun, but she knew the night would be cold. She pulled her torn buckskin dress tight around her legs and tried to make herself as small as possible. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called. Then another answered from a different direction. The sounds should have been scary, but instead they made Clara feel less alone. Even the wild creatures had families, had others who called back to them in the night. "I'm still here," she whispered to the stars, her voice barely audible. "I'm still fighting." But as exhaustion pulled her towards sleep, Clara wondered how much fight she had left in her small body. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new tests of survival, and she would face them completely alone, with nothing but her own stubborn will to keep her alive. The prairie wind carried the scent of sage and something else, something that smelled like hope, though Clara was too tired to recognize it yet. Stonehawk had been following the coyote pack for 3 days when their trail led him to something unexpected. The coyotes had been hunting a wounded deer, and Stonehawk needed to know if they were moving closer to his Shadow Peak tribe's territory. Coyotes meant danger for children and horses, but they also meant the deer were migrating, which could signal good hunting ahead. He crouched beside a cluster of rocks, studying the ground for paw prints and scat, when he caught a scent that didn't belong. the sweet, sour smell of sickness mixed with something else, something human. Stonehawk followed his nose around the boulder and found her. The white child lay curled between two stones like a small animal seeking shelter. Her blonde hair was matted with dirt and dried tears, and her pale skin was burned red from the sun. She breathed in quick, shallow gasps that told him fever had taken hold. In all his 25 winters, Stonehawk had never seen anything quite like this. White children didn't survive alone on the prairie. They didn't know how to find water or which plants were safe to eat. They certainly didn't travel this far from the wagon roads without horses or adults. Yet, here she was. Stonehawk studied the area around the rocks, reading the story written in disturbed earth and broken grass. The child had been here for at least one full day and night. Before that, her trail led back toward the whispering stream, where he could see the signs of her struggles, places where she had fallen, marks where she had crawled when walking became impossible. Most puzzling were the wagon tracks he had spotted earlier, leading west toward the Golden Valley. They were old enough to match the timeline of when this child had begun her solitary journey, but wagon tracks led away from where she had been found, not toward it. Stonehawk knelt beside the sleeping girl and placed his hand near her mouth, feeling for breath. It came warm but uneven against his palm. Her skin burned with fever, but she was alive, barely. Among his people, children were sacred gifts from the Great Spirit. Even enemy children were often adopted rather than killed, because all children carried the future in their small bodies. But this was different. This child belonged to the white world that had no place for the Shadow Peak ways. If he helped her, he would face questions from his tribe that he wasn't sure he could answer. Why risk their safety for a white child? Why bring trouble to their peaceful camp? His uncle, Elder Grey Wolf, already grumbled about Stonehawk's tendency to help wounded animals instead of leaving them for the buzzards. But if he left her here, she would be dead before the next sunrise. The child stirred, her eyes fluttering open to fix on his face. Stonehawk expected screaming. Most white children were taught that Indians were monsters who ate small girls for breakfast. Instead, she whispered something that surprised him. "Are you real, or am I dreaming?" Stonehawk had learned English from traders and missionaries over the years. The language felt clumsy in his mouth compared to the flowing sounds of his tribe, but he could speak it well enough. "I am real," he said quietly. The girl's eyes were bright blue like a winter sky, but they held an old sadness that didn't belong in such a young face. "My name is Clara," she said, as if testing whether he would care about such things. "I am called Stonehawk." He studied her carefully, noting the way she held herself, ready to run or hide, even though she clearly lacked the strength for either. "Where is your family, little one?" Something flickered across the child's face, a pain deeper than her physical wounds. "They left me," she said simply. "Said I was slowing them down." The words hit Stonehawk like a physical blow. Among the Shadow Peak tribe, abandoning a child was unthinkable, even during the hardest winters when food was scarce and the tribe had to move quickly to survive. Children were protected above everything else. The idea of leaving one behind was so foreign, it made his stomach turn. "They left you on purpose?" he asked, needing to be certain he understood correctly. Clara nodded, then immediately seemed to regret the movement as it made her dizzy. "Jedediah, that's my stepfather," she said. "The wagon was too heavy, that I ate too much food and walked too slow." Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if she had accepted this explanation completely. Stonehawk felt anger kindle in his chest, not at the child, but at the adults who had failed her so completely. How could any grown person look at this small, vulnerable creature and decide she was disposable? He pulled his water pouch from his belt and held it to her cracked lips. Drink slowly, he instructed. Clara obeyed, taking tiny sips that seemed to bring some life back to her pale face. When she had drunk enough, Stonehawk sat back on his heels and considered his options. Taking her to his tribe would create complications. The frontier marshals often followed missing white children, and soldiers meant trouble for everyone. But leaving her here meant certain death, and Stonehawk found he couldn't live with that choice. "Can you ride?" he asked. "A little," Clara said hopefully. "My papa taught me before he died." Stonehawk made his decision. He lifted the child carefully, surprised by how little she weighed, and settled her against his chest. She felt fragile as a baby bird, all hollow bones and racing heartbeat. As he carried her toward his horse, Clara spoke again, her voice muffled against his buckskin shirt. "Why are you helping me? I'm just a burden." The question stopped Stonehawk in his tracks. He looked down at the small face peeking up at him, seeing the genuine confusion there. This child truly believed she was worthless, that her life had no value beyond what she could provide for others. "Little one," he said gently, "my people believe that when the spirits send us something unexpected, it is usually because we need it, even if we don't understand why yet." Clara considered this as he boosted her onto his horse and swung up behind her. "What if the spirits made a mistake?" she asked. Stonehawk guided his horse toward the distant hills where his tribe was camped. "The spirits do not make mistakes," he said firmly, "but sometimes it takes us a while to understand their gifts." As they rode through the gathering dusk, Stonehawk found himself wondering what gift this small lost child might represent. All he knew for certain was that finding her had changed something in his chest, had awakened a protective instinct he hadn't felt since his younger sister was born. Behind them, the buzzards wheeled one more time before dispersing. Disappointed, their feast would have to wait for another day. The strange singing woke her first. Clara's eyes opened to painted buffalo hide above her head, decorated with red and blue symbols that seemed to dance in the flickering firelight. The air smelled of sage and wood smoke, nothing like the musty canvas of her family's wagon. Voices surrounded her, soft, musical words in a language that flowed like water over stones. Her throat felt like sandpaper, but when she tried to sit up, gentle hands pressed her back down. A woman's face appeared above her, bronze skin marked with tiny blue dots along her cheekbones. Her dark hair was braided with colorful beads and white feathers that caught the light. "Water," Clara whispered. The woman smiled and lifted a wooden bowl to her lips. The liquid was warm and tasted of herbs she didn't know, but it soothed her burning throat. As she drank, memories came flooding back. The stream, the fever, the man with long black hair who had found her. "Thank you," Clara said, her voice barely a croak. The woman pointed to herself. "River Song." Then she pointed to Clara with raised eyebrows. "Clara?" She paused, remembering her stepfather's harsh words about her name. "Clara Thorne." River Song repeated the name carefully, then spoke in her own language to someone Clara couldn't see. A man's voice answered from outside the dwelling, and River Song nodded with satisfaction. "Stonehawk says you are awake." "3 days," River Song said in broken English. "You were very sick, little bird." 3 days, Clara tried to remember, but everything after seeing Stonehawk's face was fuzzy. "Where am I?" "Safe place," River Song said simply. "Healing place." As if summoned by their conversation, Stonehawk ducked through the dwelling opening. In the firelight, he looked different than Clara remembered, younger, with kind eyes that studied her face with concern. He carried something in his hands, and when he knelt beside her, she gasped. It was her father's wooden eagle, the one that had fallen into the stream. But how could that be possible? "You found it," she breathed, reaching for the carved figure with trembling fingers. Stream gave it back, Stonehawk said, in careful English. Sometimes lost things find their way home when they are ready. Clara turned the eagle over in her hands. The blue paint was gone, washed away by the water, but the smooth wood felt warm and familiar. My papa made this for me before he died. Stonehawk and River Song exchanged a look. Your father is in the spirit world? River Song asked gently. Clara nodded, surprised to find that talking about it didn't hurt as much as it used to. The fever took him last winter. Then Mama married Jedediah, and he said, I was too much trouble to keep. This Jedediah, Stonehawk said slowly, he is the one who left you by the stream. He said the wagon was too heavy. The words came out matter-of-factly, but Stonehawk's expression darkened. River Song said something sharp in their language, and Stonehawk replied with what sounded like agreement. They spoke back and forth for several minutes, while Clara listened to the musical flow of their words. We do not understand white people ways, River Song said finally. Children are gifts from the spirits. They are sacred. Sacred? Clara had never heard herself described that way before. In her world, children were responsibilities, burdens to be fed and clothed and taught proper behavior. The idea that she might be sacred felt impossible. But I'm not even a good child, she said. I eat too much food, and I can't walk as fast as everyone else, and I cry too much. Stop, Stonehawk's voice was firm but gentle. Who told you these things? Jedediah. And sometimes Mama, when she thought I wasn't listening. Clara's voice grew smaller. They're not wrong. I know I'm too much trouble. Stonehawk was quiet for a long moment, studying her face. When he spoke again, his words were careful and clear. In my people's way of thinking, there is no such thing as too much trouble when it comes to children. Children are the future, walking among us. They carry tomorrow in their hearts. Clara had never heard anything like this before. In her world, children were supposed to be quiet, obedient, and grateful for whatever scraps of attention they received. The idea that she might be valuable simply for existing was harder to accept than medicine. Would you like to see our camp? River Song asked. You have been sleeping for many days. The sun and fresh air will help you grow strong again. Clara nodded, though her legs felt shaky. When River Song helped her stand, someone had dressed her in soft buckskin clothes instead of her torn calico dress. The leather was decorated with tiny beads in patterns that looked like flowers and birds. Outside the dwelling, the world was completely different from anything Clara had ever seen. Buffalo hide homes dotted the grassland in a rough circle, each one painted with different symbols and designs. Women worked around cooking fires, tending to bubbling pots that smelled delicious. Children ran between the dwellings, playing games with hoops and sticks, their laughter mixing with the sounds of horses and dogs. But what struck Clara most was how the adults watched the children. There was no impatience in their eyes, no irritation when a small boy accidentally knocked over a water pot or when a girl's excited shouts interrupted adult conversation. Instead, there was amusement, affection, and something that looked like pride. Come, River Song said, taking Clara's hand. You must eat real food now, not just healing broth. They walked toward the largest fire, where several women were preparing what looked like a feast. Clara expected to feel out of place, to have everyone stare at her with suspicion or fear. Instead, the women smiled and spoke welcoming words in their own language, gesturing for her to sit on a soft buffalo robe. One woman, her hair streaked with gray, offered Clara a piece of roasted meat that tasted better than anything she remembered eating. Another brought her sweet berries mixed with something that might have been honey. They like you, Stonehawk said, settling beside her. Morning Star says you have brave eyes. Laughing Water thinks you are sent by the spirits to bring us good fortune. But I don't bring good fortune, Clara protested. I bring trouble. Ask anyone. We are asking you, Stonehawk said simply. What do you think you bring? The question caught her off guard. No one had ever asked her opinion about herself before. Adults told children what they were, good or bad, helpful or troublesome, wanted or unwanted. The idea that she might have some say in defining herself was startling. I don't know, she admitted. Then we will help you learn, River Song said. But first, you must promise us something. Clara tensed, waiting for conditions and rules and expectations she would inevitably fail to meet. Promise us you will try to see yourself through our eyes, not through the eyes of people who could not recognize a gift when it was given to them. As the sun set over the prairie and the cooking fires painted everything in warm golden light, Clara made a promise she wasn't sure she could keep. But for the first time in her life, she was surrounded by people who seemed to believe she was worth the effort of trying. Today you learn to disappear, Stonehawk announced, leading Clara away from the camp as dawn painted the sky pink and orange. She had been with the Shadow Peak tribe for 2 weeks now, growing stronger each day under River Song's care and the nourishing food the women prepared. Her clothes fit better, her cheeks had filled out, and the constant ache of hunger had become a memory. But this morning felt different, purposeful in a way that made her stomach flutter with nervous excitement. Disappear? Clara asked, hurrying to keep up with his long strides through the tall grass. The most important skill for survival, Stonehawk said. Not fighting, not running, becoming invisible when you need to be. They stopped in a meadow, dotted with wildflowers and scattered rocks. To Clara, it looked like empty prairie, but Stonehawk studied it like a map written in a language only he could read. See that hawk circling above us? He pointed to a bird riding the morning thermals. Right now, he sees 2 humans walking in the open. But watch. Stonehawk crouched low and moved toward a cluster of bushes, his body flowing like water over stones. Even though Clara was watching carefully, she lost sight of him within moments. The hawk continued its lazy circles, showing no sign of alarm. How did you do that? She called softly. His voice came from somewhere she couldn't pinpoint. I became part of what was already here, instead of fighting against it. Your turn. But I don't know how. Stop thinking about what you don't know. His invisible voice interrupted. Think about what you do know. You are small, quiet, good at noticing things. These are gifts, not problems. Clara looked around the meadow, trying to see it the way Stonehawk might. There, a patch of tall grass near some rocks with shadows that might hide a small person. She dropped to her hands and knees and crawled toward it, moving slowly and trying to disturb as little as possible. Better, Stonehawk's voice said, though she still couldn't see him. But you're thinking too hard. Let your body remember how to be quiet. You already know this. You practiced it for years in your stepfather's wagon. The words hit her like a revelation. She had practiced being invisible, trying to take up as little space as possible, moving silently to avoid Jedediah's anger. Skills she'd learned from survival could become tools for a different kind of life. She settled into the grass and let her breathing slow, the way she used to when she needed to become unnoticeable. The world around her seemed to shift and settle, accepting her presence as part of itself. The hawk above them circled once more, then flew away toward the distant hills. Good, Stonehawk said, materializing from behind a rock she would have sworn was empty. Very good. Now comes the harder lesson. Harder than disappearing. Much harder. His expression grew serious. Learning to reappear when you choose to, not when someone else decides You're worth seeing. They spent the morning practicing what Stonehawk called shadow walking, moving through different terrains without leaving obvious tracks, using natural cover, reading the landscape for hiding places and escape routes. But between lessons, he asked questions that seemed to have nothing to do with survival skills. When you lived with your family, did you ever speak your true thoughts? I tried to stay quiet mostly. But when you did speak, what happened? Clara considered this. Jedediah would get angry if I asked for things. Mama would look sad if I talked about Papa. So I learned what not to say. And what did you want to say? The question opened something inside her chest, a flood of words and feelings she'd kept locked away for so long she'd almost forgotten they existed. I wanted to ask why Papa had to die. I wanted to tell Mama that I missed our old homestead. I wanted to say that I was scared about going to the Golden Valley and that I didn't understand why Jedediah hated me so much, and that sometimes I had dreams where Papa came back and everything was the way it used to be. Stonehawk nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Those are important words, words that needed to be spoken. But they would have made everyone upset. Sometimes the most important words do make people upset. That doesn't mean they shouldn't be said. They had found their way to a small creek where Stonehawk taught her how to cross moving water without disturbing the mud or leaving footprints on the banks. The lesson required careful balance and patience, placing each foot precisely while reading the current and the depth. "Why are you teaching me this?" Clara asked as they sat on the far bank, sharing dried meat and wild berries that Riversong had packed for them. "Because knowledge is power," Stonehawk said. "The more you know about surviving on your own, the more choices you have. Choices are freedom." "But I'm just a child. Children don't get to choose things." "Says who?" The question was so simple, it was startling. "Says everyone. Adults make decisions for children because children don't know enough. Do you think you know enough to choose whether you want to be treated with kindness or cruelty?" "Well, yes." "Do you know enough to choose whether you want to eat when you're hungry?" "Of course." "Do you know enough to choose whether you want to live with people who see you as a gift or people who see you as a burden?" Clara was quiet for a long moment, watching the water flow over smooth stones. "I think so." "Then you know enough to make the choices that matter most." As the day wore on, Stonehawk taught her to identify edible plants, to read weather signs in the behavior of animals, and to find water by following game trails. But woven through every practical lesson was something deeper, a different way of seeing herself and her place in the world. "In your white settlements," he said, as they watched a family of rabbits emerge from their burrow to feed in the late afternoon light, "who decides a person's worth? Important people, I guess. People with money, or land, or education. And what makes them qualified to judge?" Clara had never considered this before. They just are, because they're successful. Successful at what? At being important. Stonehawk smiled. "That is circular thinking, little one. They are important because they are successful, and they are successful because they are important. But what if importance and worth are different things?" He pointed to the rabbits who were teaching their young ones where to find the sweetest grass. "The rabbit mother is not important in your world's way of thinking. She owns no land, has no money, holds no title, but she knows things that keep her family alive. She has worth that cannot be measured by human standards. So worth comes from what you know, what you can do. Worth comes from being alive," Stonehawk said simply. "Everything else, knowledge, skills, achievements, those are gifts you give to the world. But your worth exists before you give anything at all." As they walked back toward camp, Clara felt something shifting inside her understanding of herself. For 8 seasons, she had believed that her value came from being useful, from not causing trouble, from earning the right to exist through good behavior. But Stonehawk and his people seemed to believe that her existence itself was valuable, that her thoughts and feelings and dreams mattered simply because they were hers. "What if I'm not brave enough to believe that?" she asked, as the camp's cooking fires came into view. "Then you practice believing it," Stonehawk said, "the same way you practice becoming invisible. A little bit at a time, until it becomes as natural as breathing." That night, as Clara lay on her buffalo robes, listening to the familiar sounds of the camp settling into sleep, she whispered a small practice to herself. "I matter because I'm alive. My thoughts are important because they're mine. I have worth that nobody can take away." The words felt strange and powerful, like magic spells that might change everything if she could learn to believe them completely. Outside, the prairie wind carried the scent of sage and distant rain, and somewhere in the darkness, a night bird called out a song that sounded almost like hope. The thunder of 30 horses shook the ground beneath Clara's feet like an earthquake made of anger and steel. She dropped the wild berries she'd been gathering and ran toward the camp, her heart beating so fast it hurt. Behind her, dust clouds rose higher than trees, and the sound of metal jangling grew louder with each second. Stonehawk appeared beside her like a shadow, his strong arms lifting her onto his horse without breaking stride. "Soldiers," he said, his voice tight as a drawn bow. "Many soldiers." The Shadow Peak camp exploded into movement. Women grabbed children and precious belongings. Warriors reached for weapons and painted horses. Dogs barked warnings, while elders shouted instructions in voices that cut through the chaos like knives through butter. Clara's stomach twisted into knots. She had heard the older children whisper about blue-coat soldiers who came to take native children to faraway schools where they forgot their families forever. But she had never imagined they might come for her too. "Hide me," she whispered to Stonehawk as they raced between the dwellings. "Please don't let them take me back." Stonehawk's jaw hardened like stone. "Little rabbit, some fights cannot be avoided, but they can be won." The frontier marshals burst into view like a blue wave crashing against the shore. Their horses snorted and stamped, tired from hard riding, but still dangerous. The captain at the front, Captain Silas Vance, had eyes like winter ice and a mustache that twitched when he spoke. Behind him rode marshals with rifles across their saddles and expressions that said they expected trouble. But it was the man riding beside the captain that made Clara's blood turn cold. Jedediah Thorne sat straight in his saddle, pointing directly at her with a finger that shook with excitement. "There she is. That's the Thorne girl. I told you the savages had taken her." The word savages hit the air like a slap. Several Shadow Peak warriors took steps forward, their hands moving toward their weapons. The tension stretched tight as a rope about to snap. Captain Silas Vance, Clara could see his name sewn onto his blue jacket, raised one hand to stop his marshals from drawing their guns. With his other hand, he gestured for the Shadow Peak warriors to stay calm. He was older than most of his men, with gray streaking his brown hair and scars on his face that spoke of many battles. "I am Captain Vance of the Frontier Marshals," he called out in a voice that carried across the entire camp. "We're here for the white child. No one needs to get hurt if you cooperate." Elder Grey Wolf stepped forward, magnificent in his eagle feather headdress and painted war shirt. Though he was past his 50th winter, he moved with the grace of a much younger man. When he spoke, his English was perfect and sharp as a blade. "Captain Vance, you are welcome to water your horses and rest your men, but you are not welcome to make demands in my camp." The two leaders faced each other like wolves, deciding whether to fight or flee. Around them, 30 marshals fingered their rifles, while 60 Shadow Peak warriors stood ready to defend their home. The air crackled with a kind of danger that made smart people hold their breath. Clara slipped down from Stonehawk's horse and walked slowly toward the center of the camp. Every eye followed her movement. She was just one small girl, but somehow she had become the spark that could start a fire that would burn down everything. "Captain Vance," she said, her voice smaller than she wanted, but clear enough for everyone to hear. "I'm Clara Thorne." The captain studied her with sharp eyes that missed nothing. He saw her braided hair with feathers woven through it. He saw her buckskin dress decorated with beads and porcupine quills. He saw her sun-darkened skin and the confidence in her posture that hadn't been there when she was abandoned months ago. "Miss Thorne," he said carefully, "your stepfather here says you were kidnapped by these people. He's been searching for you for months." Jedediah nudged his horse closer, his face red with the effort of looking like a concerned parent. "Clara, honey, don't be afraid. These savages can't hurt you anymore. Uncle Sam's army is here to take you home." Home. The word sat in Clara's mouth like a stone. She looked around the camp that had become more home to her than anywhere she'd ever lived. She saw Riversong's worried face, Stonehawk's protective stance, and the dozens of people who had made room for her in their hearts without asking for anything in return. "Mr. Thorne," she said, using his formal name on purpose, "where is my mother?" The question seemed to surprise him. He shifted in his saddle and glanced at Captain Vance before answering. "Your mother, she took sick on the trail. The fever got her, child. That's why I came back for you. Family has to stick together." But Clara had spent months learning to read faces the way Stonehawk read animal tracks. She saw the lie hiding behind Jedediah's eyes like a snake in tall grass. She saw the way his hand shook slightly and how he couldn't quite meet her gaze. "You're lying," she said simply. The words dropped into the silence like stones into a still pond, sending ripples of shock through both groups. Jedediah's face went from red to white to red again. "Now, see here, you little—" Captain Vance cut him off with a voice like a whip crack. He turned back to Clara with new interest. "What makes you say he's lying, child?" Clara took a deep breath, tasting the moment that would change everything around her. She felt the weight of 60 Shadow Peak lives hanging on her next words. Behind her, she felt the strength of people who had chosen to love her without conditions. This was it, the moment when she would either save her new family or watch them suffer for her sake. But what truth could an 8-season-old girl tell that would make hardened marshals believe her over a white man's word? "Because he's the one who left me to die." Clara's words exploded across the camp like gunpowder, leaving a ringing silence in their wake. Captain Vance's weathered face went stone still, while Jedediah Thorne's mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. That's ridiculous," Jedediah sputtered, his voice climbing higher with each word. "She's been living with savages for months. They've filled her head with lies and poison against her own kind." But Captain Vance held up his hand for silence, this time his movement sharp enough to make several marshals reach for their weapons, his grey eyes never leaving Clara's face. In 20 years of frontier service, he had learned to spot truth in the most unlikely places. Something in this child's steady gaze reminded him of his own daughter back in Austin. "Explain yourself, Miss Thorne," he said quietly. Clara felt her knees shaking, but she forced herself to stand tall. Around her, she could sense the Shadow Peak warriors ready to fight and die for her if necessary. The weight of their trust gave her courage she didn't know she possessed. "We were 3 days past Silverleaf Creek when our wagon broke an axle," she began, her voice growing stronger with each word. "Mr. Thorne said we were behind schedule because of me. He said I ate too much food and walked too slow and made the wagon too heavy. She pointed directly at Jedediah, whose face had gone pale as a winter sky. He told my mother they had to choose between making it to the Golden Valley or keeping me. So they left me by Whispering Waters with 3 pieces of hardtack and directions to find the Oakhaven family. Lies! Jedediah shouted, but his voice cracked like thin ice. The girl's confused. She's been brainwashed by these heathens. Captain Vance raised his hand again, but this time his movement was sharp enough to make several marshals reach for their weapons. Let her finish. Clara's heart pounded like war drums, but she pressed on. My mother cried when she said goodbye. She told me to follow the North Star and that the Oakhavens would take me in if I was good enough. But I got sick before I found them. I had fever and couldn't keep water down, and I would have died if Stonehawk hadn't found me. She gestured toward the tall Shadow Peak hunter who stood silent and proud beside his horse. He saved my life when my own family threw it away. Jedediah spurred his horse forward, his face twisted with desperate anger. You can't believe this child over a grown white man. She's been corrupted by living with Indians. They've turned her against her own people. But Captain Vance was studying Jedediah now with the same careful attention he'd given Clara. The captain's eyes took in the man's nervous gestures, his shifting gaze, and the way sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Mr. Thorne, the captain said slowly, where exactly did you say your wagon train was attacked? What does that matter? The important thing is getting the girl back where she belongs. Humor me. Jedediah's hands trembled on his reins. It was near Blackwood Pass. Yes, Blackwood Pass. That's where the Shadow Peak warriors hit us. Captain Vance exchanged glances with his deputy, a grizzled man named Boone, who had been fighting frontier outlaws for 15 years. Boone shook his head slightly. Interesting, the captain said, because there haven't been any Shadow Peak raids near Blackwood Pass in over 2 years, and certainly no reports of captured children. The lie hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Jedediah's face went through several colors before settling on a sickly yellow-green. Perhaps, Captain Vance continued, you'd like to revise your story, Mr. Thorne. But Jedediah was past the point of clever lies. Desperation made him dangerous as a cornered wolf. It doesn't matter how she got here. She's a white child living with savages. It's not natural. It's not Christian. You have a duty to bring her back to civilization. Stonehawk stepped forward then, his movement fluid as water but unmistakably threatening. When he spoke, his English was careful and precise. Captain Vance, this man speaks of duty and civilization. But what civilization abandons its children to die alone? Now you listen here, Jedediah started. No! The captain's voice cut like a cavalry saber. You listen, Thorne. I've heard enough. He turned to address both groups, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to making life and death decisions. In 20 years of service, I've seen men lie about many things, but I've never seen a child lie about being abandoned. That kind of pain doesn't come from imagination. Jedediah made one last desperate play. Even if what she says is true, she's still a white child. She can't stay with Indians. It's against the law. Whose law? Elder Greywolf spoke for the first time since the confrontation began. The same law that allows a man to abandon a child like unwanted baggage. Captain Vance looked around the camp, taking in the faces of people who had clearly welcomed Clara as one of their own. He saw Riversong standing protectively near the girl, her hand resting gently on Clara's shoulder. He saw the careful way the Shadow Peak children included her in their games, and the respect in the warriors' eyes when they looked at her. Then he looked at Jedediah Thorne and saw a man whose greed for gold had overcome his basic humanity. Deputy Boone, the captain said finally, Yes, sir. Place Mr. Thorne under arrest for child abandonment and filing a false report with the territorial government. Jedediah's face went white as cotton. You can't do this. She's just one half-dead brat. No one will miss her. But even as the deputy moved to restrain him, Jedediah's words had sealed his fate. In trying to justify his actions, he had confirmed everything Clara had said. As the marshals prepared to escort their prisoner away, Captain Vance approached Clara one final time. His gruff features had softened slightly, revealing the father beneath the officer. Miss Thorne, he said gently, I can't leave you here. The territorial government has strict policies about white children living with Indian tribes. But I give you my word that we'll find you a good home with people who will value you properly. Clara looked up at him with eyes that held more wisdom than any 8-season-old should possess. Captain Vance, what if I told you I've already found that? The question hung between them like a bridge neither knew how to cross. In the distance, Jedediah Thorne's angry shouts grew fainter as the marshals led him away to face justice for his crimes. But justice for Jedediah didn't solve the larger problem. What happened when the law said one thing and the heart said another? The frontier chapel bell rang, loud and clear across the snowy frontier town, but 8-season-old Clara Thorne barely heard it anymore. Sunday mornings had become as regular as breathing during her 6 months with the Oakhaven family. She sat straight in the wooden pew, hands folded like a proper young lady, listening to the preacher talk about being grateful for the Great Spirit's plan. But her mind kept wandering to a different kind of prayer, the ones River Song had taught her under the stars, where gratitude mixed with wild freedom instead of quiet sitting. Clara, dear, you're fidgeting again, whispered Mrs. Oakhaven, placing a gentle hand on her arm. Clara forced herself to sit still. The Oakhavens were good people who had given her a warm home, plenty of food, and new dresses that fit perfectly. She should be happy. Everyone said so. The preacher said so. The other families in town said so. Even Clara told herself so every morning when she brushed her hair into neat braids instead of the loose style Riversong had shown her. After chapel, the families gathered outside to talk about weather and crops, while children played tag in the snow. Clara stood next to Mrs. Oakhaven, smiling politely when adults patted her head and said what a blessing it was that she'd been saved from those savages. Each time someone said those words, something twisted in her stomach like a knife, but she had learned to nod and say, "Yes, sir," or "Yes, ma'am," because disagreeing made people uncomfortable, and making people uncomfortable meant they might not want to keep her. That afternoon, while Mr. Oakhaven read stories to his twin boys by the fire, Clara helped Mrs. Oakhaven bake bread for the sick families in town. The kitchen smelled like home, warm and yeasty and safe. Mrs. Oakhaven hummed while she worked, occasionally asking Clara to fetch this or measure that. "You've been quieter than usual lately," Mrs. Oakhaven said as they kneaded the dough together. "Is something troubling you?" Clara's hands stilled in the soft, warm dough. How could she explain that she felt like she was slowly disappearing, that every day she acted more like the girl everyone expected her to be? She forgot a little more about who she really was. "I'm fine, ma'am," she said instead, because that's what good girls said. Mrs. Oakhaven studied her face with kind but worried eyes. "You know you can tell me anything, don't you? Nothing you could say would change how much we care about you." The words were meant to comfort, but they only made the ache in Clara's chest grow bigger because she knew, with the sharp knowledge that comes from experience, that there were absolutely things she could say that would change everything. Things about feeling more at home in a buffalo hide dwelling than a log house. Things about missing the taste of buffalo meat and the sound of drums. things about dreaming in a language that wasn't English. "I know, Mom," Clara said quietly, returning to her kneading. Later that evening, after the bread was delivered and supper was eaten and prayers were said, Clara lay in her soft bed, staring at the ceiling. Through her window, she could see snow falling in thick, lazy flakes. The sight reminded her of the first time she'd seen snow with the Shadow Peak tribe. Stonehawk had caught flakes on his tongue and laughed when she tried to do the same. She reached under her mattress and pulled out Riversong's medicine bundle, unwrapping it carefully in the darkness. Inside were dried herbs that still held their scent, a small piece of turquoise, and a tiny carved horse that one of the Shadow Peak children had given her. Touching these treasures was like touching a different version of herself, one who didn't have to apologize for taking up space. A soft sound outside her window made her freeze. It was probably just the wind in the trees, or maybe a cat hunting mice in the barn, but something about it made her heart beat faster. The sound came again. Definitely not wind. More like a horse shifting its weight, the leather of a saddle creaking softly. Clara slipped out of bed and crept to the window, careful not to let the floorboards squeak. She pressed her face to the cold glass and peered out into the snowy yard. At first, she saw nothing but white shapes and shadows. Then, at the edge of the tree line, where the Oakhaven's property met the wild prairie, she spotted something that made her breath catch in her throat. A rider sat perfectly still on his horse, watching the house. Even in the darkness and falling snow, even though months had passed since she'd seen him, she knew exactly who it was. Stonehawk had come back. Her hands shook as she pressed them against the window glass. He was really there, not a dream or a wishful thought, but flesh and blood and warmth in the cold night. He had risked everything, marshals and laws and the danger of being shot on sight, to find her. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other across the snowy distance. Then Stonehawk raised one hand in a small gesture, not quite a wave, not quite a signal, but something that said, "I see you." Clara's eyes filled with tears. She hadn't let herself cry in months. Someone had remembered her. Someone had come looking for the real Clara, not the polite, grateful version she'd been pretending to be. She pressed her hand to the glass in answer, and even though he couldn't possibly see such a small movement from so far away, Stonehawk nodded once before melting back into the shadows. Clara stood at her window, long after he disappeared, her heart pounding with possibility and fear and something that felt dangerously like hope. She had a choice to make now, the biggest choice of her life, and for the first time in months, she felt like herself again. Dawn broke pink and gold over the Texas prairie, painting the snow-covered ground in colors that made Clara think of the sunrise ceremonies Riversong had shared with her. She stood at the crossroads where the path to the Oakhaven log house split away from the old Shadow Peak trail, her small satchel heavy with the few things that truly mattered. Inside the bag, her father's wooden eagle, worn smooth from countless touches, Riversong's medicine bundle, carefully rewrapped in soft deerskin, a letter for the Oakhavens explaining her choice in words she hoped they would understand, and 3 pieces of hardtack, not because she needed them for the journey, but because they reminded her of how far she'd come from that scared, abandoned child by the whispering waters. The morning air was crisp and clean, filled with the scent of snow and pine, and something else, something wild and free that called to the part of her she'd been hiding for too long. Clara had left before the Oakhavens woke up, before Mrs. Oakhaven could make her favorite pancakes, or Mr. Oakhaven could read the morning prayers. She'd slipped away like morning mist, leaving only the letter on her neatly made bed to explain where she'd gone. Writing that letter had been the hardest thing she'd ever done. harder even than watching her mother's wagon disappear into the dust, because the Oakhavens had been truly kind to her, and leaving felt like betraying that kindness. But she had finally understood the difference between being grateful and being true to herself. She could be both, but not in the same place. As she walked west along the barely visible trail, following signs that most people would never notice, a bent branch here, a particular arrangement of stones there, Clara felt pieces of herself clicking back into place like puzzle pieces finding their proper spots. The sun climbed higher, warming her face and melting the snow into tiny streams that sparkled like diamonds. She passed a family of rabbits, playing in a clearing, their brown fur stark against the white ground. One of them sat up on its hind legs and watched her pass, and Clara smiled, remembering Stonehawk's lessons about being quick and clever like the rabbit. By midday, she could smell wood smoke on the wind, the particular scent of buffalo chips burning that meant Shadow Peak fires. Her steps quickened, and she began to see familiar landmarks: the lightning-split oak tree, the red rocks shaped like a sleeping bear, the hill where she'd first learned to identify different types of clouds. Then, spread out before her like a picture from a wonderful dream, she saw the camp. The dwellings stood in their traditional circle, hide covers painted with symbols that told stories of hunts and visions and family histories. Horses grazed peacefully in the distance, their winter coats thick and shaggy. Children played in the snow, their laughter carrying on the clear air like music. And there, working on arrows outside his dwelling, was Stonehawk. He looked up, as if he'd felt her watching him, and the smile that spread across his face was like the sun coming out from behind clouds. He stood slowly, setting down his work, and for a moment they simply looked at each other across the distance. "Little rabbit," he called, his voice carrying easily in the thin air. "Stonehawk," she called back, and suddenly her feet were running without her permission, carrying her across the snowy ground toward home. Riversong emerged from her dwelling at the sound of voices, and when she saw Clara running toward them, she let out a cry of joy that brought the whole camp spilling out to see what was happening. Soon, Clara was surrounded by familiar faces, familiar voices speaking her name, familiar hands touching her hair and face as if to make sure she was real. "You came back," Riversong said, tears streaming down her cheeks as she pulled Clara into a fierce hug. "I came home," Clara corrected, breathing in the scent of sage and wood smoke and belonging that clung to Riversong's clothes. That evening, as the camp settled into its nightly rhythms around her, Clara sat by the central fire and told her story. She spoke of the Oakhaven's kindness, and the warm log house, and the frontier chapel with its tall bell tower. She talked about learning to bake bread and mend clothes and speak only when spoken to. "They were good to me," she said carefully, "but good to me and good for me are different things." The adults nodded, understanding flickering in their eyes. Among the Shadow Peak tribe, children were valued for who they were, not who they might become with enough training and correction. "And what are you, Clara, who chooses her own path?" asked the elder Grey Wolf, an old man whose voice carried the weight of many seasons. Clara touched the wooden eagle at her throat, thinking of her father and the love that had carved it, thinking of her mother's trembling hands and the fear that had driven her away, thinking of the Oakhaven's kindness and Stonehawk's rescue and Riversong's wisdom. "I am someone who belongs wherever she chooses to belong," she said finally. "Someone whose worth comes from inside, not from what other people think about her. Someone who was lost and then found and then lost again, but who finally found herself." "Yes," said the elder Grey Wolf quietly, "you are." As the fire burned low and the stars emerged overhead, Clara lay in the dwelling, that had always been waiting for her return. Outside, an owl called across the prairie, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote sang to the moon. She was no longer the abandoned child crying in the wilderness. She was no longer the grateful orphan trying to earn her place. She was Clara, who had learned that the most important journey wasn't the one that took you away from yourself, but the one that brought you home to who you really were. And in choosing her own belonging, she had discovered something more valuable than safety or comfort or even love. She had found her own worth, claimed it for herself, and learned that once claimed, it could never be taken away again. The prairie wind whispered through the camp, carrying promises of spring and new beginnings, and Clara smiled as she drifted off to sleep, finally and completely home.